One of the best things to come out of Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was the Uruk-hai. The way that they were designed, acted out, and especially their involvement at the Battle of Helm's Deep was simply amazing to watch on the big screen. But what if I told you that their largest and most important moment in the book was not them swinging a sword, and maybe that's why Peter Jackson completely cut it from the film? That's right, their involvement at the beginning of the Two Towers film is literally a 2-minute scene, but the book spends an entire chapter depicting their capture and transportation of Merry and Pippin to Isengard. From Pippin's perspective, we get to hear their conversations, witness the divisive politics between orcs and Uruk-hai, and see the real pursuit of the Riders of Rohan, which ends in the slaughter of the entire enemy camp. Plus, because Peter Jackson tremendously cuts down this chapter, we miss out on one of Pippin's most genius moments, which results in him and Merry later escaping. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 20 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I take your favorite fantasy works and compare the original to the adaptation, finding every single difference scene by scene. Today, we are on to our second episode in the Two Towers, as we finally switch from Frodo and Sam's perspective to find out what is happening with our two other hobbits. I know the last few weeks I have been covering multiple scenes as they all go together in a sequence, but today we have a chapter of the book which spends a decent amount of time talking about something that is completely omitted from the film: the Uruk-hai's perspective. Although we don't directly get a narrative from inside the mind of Ugluk, the Uruk-hai commander, we do get to hear about all of the events that happened during Merry and Pippin's journey from being captured all the way to Fangorn Forest. Today we won't go as far as the attack at Fangorn, as the movie doesn't cover that until later, but we will discuss everything that was changed or removed from this brief 2-minute scene at the beginning of the movie. Much like Tom Bombadil in The Old Forest, this part of the book was cut for time. So after you're done with this video, comment your thoughts below on whether you think it was the right decision to remove this massive section. Speaking of comments, shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. If you want to get featured in one of my future videos, make sure to drop your thoughts below. As always, I'll cover the changes across the 4 categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happens in this scene, which shouldn't take that long as it is pretty brief. After seeing Gollum lead Frodo and Sam out of Emyn Muil, we switch to a different part of Middle-earth as a pack of Uruk-hai are running through some rocks and stop to meet up with some orcs. We see Merry and Pippin are strapped to their backs, and Merry looks injured while Pippin is waking up from being unconscious and tries to call for Merry. We get to see the leader of the orc pack talking to the leader of the Uruk-hai, telling him that he's late and that his master grows impatient. He says that he wants the Shire Rats now, but the Uruk-hai commander won't have this, as he says that he doesn't take orders from orc maggots, and that Saruman will have his prize and the Uruk-hai will deliver it. Real quick, it is important to know that Saruman is the only one mentioned at this point, and it could easily be interpreted that the orcs are also from Saruman, trying to take the credit for the Uruk-hai's capture. Keep that in mind as we'll cover this more in the plot changes. Anyway, the camera switches back to being on Merry and Pippin calls out for help as he says his friend is sick and needs a drink. The Uruk-hai force feed him one of their drinks, which I am sure is pretty disgusting, and Merry wakes up spewing out the gross liquid. Pippin shouts at them to stop, but the Uruk-hai commander tells him to shut it unless he wants some too. Merry and Pippin then whisper to each other as Merry says he's alright and he was faking it. Suddenly, one of the Uruk-hai sniffs the air and informs the leader that he smells man-flesh. After realizing that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli have picked up on their trail, they run off again, but Pippin overhears them and thinks of a quick way to leave a clue for his friends to follow. He undoes the clasp of his cloak from Lorien and drops it to the ground, and we see it get smushed into the ground as some Uruk-hai stamp by. And that is where we cut off for this week. Pretty short, right? Well, like I said, it's actually a lot longer of a section in the book. The Uruk-hai kill a few orcs, Pippin nearly escapes, and they actually help to heal Merry's wound. That's just a few of the changes, but they probably don't make much sense right now, so let's dive into our first category of character differences. All in all, the characters are pretty much the same, but I think it is a good idea to name them off, as in the book we actually do learn who they are. Although the movie shows them, we don't really ever learn their names. As for those who do the speaking, the Uruk-hai commander is Ugluk, and the orc leader is Grishnak. Also, a Nazgul is mentioned, and then obviously we have Merry and Pippin. Now technically there is one group that is excluded from the movies, although they aren't named individually in the book. We simply learn of them as the orcs from the Misty Mountains or the orcs from the north. This is the group of orcs who followed the Fellowship since Moria, but we'll cover that in a little bit. As for timeline and location, there really aren't any changes other than the fact that the movie skips over the Uruk-hai's entire journey. We pretty much only see the beginning and the end of this journey in the movie. Location-wise, the only difference is that the Uruk-hai and orcs get stopped by the Rohirrim before they reach the edge of Fangorn. In the movie, they get to the edge of the forest, but just don't go inside of it yet. This will play into another big change near the end of today's episode, so stick around to find out what happens. By the way, if you're wanting to read this chapter for yourself and follow along with me each week as I do this series, grab your free copy of The Two Towers using my Audible free trial link in the video description. Alright, so now let's head into our favorite category, which is plot changes. I want to preface this section by saying that today we will of course be covering the changes, but I'm also going to be diving a little deeper and trying to summarize what really happens in this chapter. This will be similar to my videos on the Old Forest and Tom Bombadil in the sense that so much was removed from the scene that if I just covered strictly the changes, the video would only be about 2 minutes long. So I wanted to explain what actually happens in this chapter so that we can get an idea of what the perspective of the Uruk-hai and orcs was during the hunt. This is a part that I sorely miss from the movie, as there's so many cool moments that completely get removed because of the shortening of this experience. So let's start with how this chapter begins. The chapter opens with the orcs resting for a bit and Pippin waking up from being unconscious, recalling how Merry and him got captured back at Parthgallen. He is just barely conscious and remembers yelling for Frodo in the forest before being captured, and then he wakes and realizes that he and Merry are bound and surrounded by orcs. He then goes through and tries to remember the events leading up until now, and we finally get to hear the other side of the story, as so far in the book we only know Aragorn's point of view. Pippin recalls how they ran straight into a pack of orcs in the forest, and the orcs didn't seem to want to fight, but rather just get their hands on the hobbits. He mentions how Merry even cut off a few of their arms and hands before they got captured, and even after that the orcs didn't try to harm them. But as soon as the orcs got their hands on them, Boromir came leaping into the rescue and slew many of them, eventually causing the rest to flee. But the victory was short-lived, as Pippin remembers at least 100 more orcs quickly running in to fight with Boromir. Many of the orcs shot arrows at Boromir, and Pippin's last memory was his vision fading as he watched Boromir leaning up against a tree, plucking an arrow from his body. Pippin then supposes that he was knocked in the head, and that's why he doesn't remember anything else. So I know this kind of relates to the final episode of the Fellowship of the Ring I did, but I guess now that we know the other side of the story, it's worth mentioning that Merry and Pippin didn't really witness Boromir get killed officially. Although Pippin says he saw Boromir leaning up against a tree, he is talking to himself afterwards and wonders if Boromir is alive or not. So technically, he doesn't know for sure if he survived yet. The next change is that there were already orcs with the Uruk-hai. In the movie, at the beginning, they show a pack of Uruk-hai running with the hobbits bound up. But in the book, the orcs were also with them, as they met up with the Uruks before they attacked the Fellowship at Amon Hen. The orcs do quickly pop out of the rocks and meet up with the Uruk-hai in the film, but in the books, they would have been together the whole time. We get the sense that there is already tension between the two groups, as after Pippin wakes up, one of the orcs looks at him and tells him that if he had it his way, he would make him squeal. Then the orc curses Ugluk, the Uruk-hai captain, as well as the other Isengarders. Pippin then hears him go off on a rant in their own black speech and picks up Ugluk's name from time to time. Obviously, this orc isn't happy that Ugluk is sticking to Saruman's wishes of keeping the hobbits unspoiled. This of course will become a recurring theme and get shown later on the edge of Fangorn Forest, but in the book it happens immediately. Next, we hear a lot more of the orc and Uruk's conversation in the book. Per usual, I can't go into every single line of dialogue, but I do feel like this bit is important, as Peter Jackson used a lot of this dialogue to fill in gaps for his Saruman scenes, which aren't talked about explicitly in the books. While Pippin is awake, he lies still and listens to the orcs and Uruk-hai speak with each other. As I just mentioned, the orcs wanted to kill the hobbits, as that's what orcs do, but the Uruk-hai, being better rule followers, say that the halflings are meant to be kept alive and taken to Isengard. Most of the orcs, who are serving Sauron, not Saruman, are not happy about this, as it seems every second they spend with the hobbits, they die a little inside. This whole conversation gives a lot more personality to the orcs and the Uruk-hai. We get to hear that a lot of them are a bit more than mindless drones, as some of them ask questions that are pretty legitimate. Why are the hobbits meant to be kept alive? Do they have something of value? It is key to note that there is a bit of questioning from both parties. Some of the Uruk-hai and some of the orcs are curious. One of the enemies remarks that he heard the halflings have something of value that is meant to be used in the war, an elvish weapon. Unlike the movie though, the Uruk-hai says that they should search the hobbits as they might find it and be able to use it themselves. Then we hear from the captains of each group, who are the captains for a reason, as they seem to be the most strict. The orc captain says that his orders are that they should not be plundered or harmed, and the Uruk-hai captain says the same thing. Obviously, both Saruman and Sauron don't want the ring falling into the hands of some idiot orcs. Plus, a small note is that the orc commander says he might have to report the Uruk-hai, who suggested they plunder the halflings. Obviously, he is threatening that he would tell one of the Nazgul about this. This shuts most of them up who know better and know the Nazgul, except a third group that I briefly mentioned in the character changes. You see, there weren't just orcs from Sauron and Uruk-hai from Saruman in this group. There was actually a third group, the orcs from the Misty Mountains, the ones who had encountered the Fellowship in Moria. They had been tracking the Fellowship since the mines, as they had slain many of their kind, including one of their chieftains. It is important to note that orcs would often chase down their foes for many miles to avenge one of their captains. Once they slew whoever killed their captain, they would go back to their mountain and chill. So after Ugluk and Grishnak, the orc commander, tell them that the halflings are off limits, a member of the third party speaks up and says that those aren't his orders, as they came to kill and then go back to their mine. He says that they want to kill the halflings now. In the movie, this third party from the mountain is completely removed. Next, we miss one of their more heated conversations, which gets incredibly cut down for the scene in the film. Near the end of their conversation, we hear them have a debate about which direction to take. Grishnak, who is very full of himself and definitely thinks a lot of his position, says that a Nazgul is waiting for them at Lugboots. He says that they must take the hobbits there, but this is met with much opposition. Ugluk finally names himself as the captain of the fighting Uruk-hai, and he lists off their accomplishments. They were the ones who slew the great warrior, meaning Boromir. They were the ones who captured the halflings, and they were the ones who met up with the orcs and led them to Amon Hen in the first place. So in his eyes, they deserve to take the halflings to Isengard and get their reward. Plus, they are the loyal servants of Saruman the Wise. Grishnak then calls Saruman a treacherous fool, and says the Great Eye is on him. Honestly, this is pretty wise from Grishnak, and he must have gotten word from the Nazgul that Saruman was not to be trusted, which is why the hobbits must come straight back to them instead of Isengard. Grishnak also says that Saruman is probably feeding his Uruk-hai orc flesh, not man flesh, as Ugluk had previously bragged about. This causes many of the orcs to draw their swords and get riled up, but Ugluk shouts for his backup and a few Uruk-hai join him. And this leads in to one of the largest omissions from the film, which is Pippin's quick thinking in this moment that is crucial to their later escape. In the movie, we just see them tied to the backs of the Uruk-hai, and only see the orcs fighting and the hobbits escaping at the edge of Fangorn. But in the book, they nearly escape right at the beginning during this heated conversation. Here's what happened. After they get riled up, Pippin notes that the Uruk-hai who are guarding him jump up and run over to the group. He spots Ugluk and Grishnak as they stand out from the rest, and then sees Ugluk spring forward and quickly behead two of the orcs, and Grishnak, being the coward that he is, fades into the background to avoid the fight. One of the bodies falls on Pippin right after he gets his head taken off, and he hears Ugluk shout at everyone that they are to head to Isengard and march day and night. Pippin then begins thinking that if he can have a few more moments of them being mad at each other, he might have a chance to escape. He then notices the sword of the orc who fell on him actually cut his arm, but he could still feel it resting against him, giving him the idea to cut loose his bonds. He quickly cuts himself loose and then reknots the rope loosely and slips it back over his hands so it looks like he's still bound. Right after he does this, Ugluk shouts for them to grab the prisoners and get a move on, and Pippin gets picked up and slammed against someone's back, causing him to lose consciousness again. I think in this moment he would have escaped if it hadn't have been for Merry, who was still unconscious at this point, but at least he was quick enough to think to undo his rope, which really is the main reason they're able to escape later on. Honestly, let's just give some props to Pippin, as he is finally getting some decent moments. Of course, this doesn't fit Peter Jackson's goofy version of Pippin in the movie, so it's probably why this quick thinking got cut. So now we finally come to one of the moments they show in this brief scene in the movie, which is when Merry fakes being hurt and is force-fed some gross liquid. This scene is inspired from an actual moment in the book, but has changed quite a bit for the film. Here is what really happens. The next time Pippin wakes up, he realizes that they're on a stony cliffside as the group has stopped again. He overhears a scout coming back and giving a report to Ugluk. The scout says that he saw one horseman and that the coast is clear, but this infuriates Ugluk as he says they should have killed the single horseman. Now they will have to leg it double time, as the single horseman will go back and give his report, causing them to be attacked by many horsemen. Ugluk then goes to Pippin and cuts his leg bonds, saying that he's tired of carrying them and that they'll have to put their legs to use. He gives Pippin a gross drink that is like fire in Pippin's throat, but shortly afterwards he feels energized and rejuvenated. Pippin then sees Merry getting woken up as well. So far, Merry has had a cloth wrapped around his head, which is different from the film, but the Uruk-hai remove it and Pippin sees a large gash. The Uruk-hai, who are trying to keep the hobbits unspoiled, take an ointment and rub it on the wound, causing Merry to writhe in pain. Ugluk then says the line of, "Can't take your medicine," like in the movie. Alright, so far in this exchange, here are the differences. First, they make the hobbits walk on their own for a time. Second, Pippin never shouts for them to help Merry. Third, the Uruk-hai's drink, as disgusting as it is, actually does energize them. And fourth, they use an ointment to treat Merry's head injury. See what I meant earlier when I said although it's inspired from the book, it has changed drastically for the film? Fun fact is that Tolkien writes Merry's ointment quickly did heal his wound and he didn't suffer from it afterwards. However, he did bear a brown scar till the end of his days. The next change from a moment in these scenes is when Pippin leaves his Lothlorien cloak clasp for Aragorn to find. Again, although this does happen in the book, the circumstances under which it happens are much different. While the orcs and Uruk-hai are running after they climb down a cliff, Merry and Pippin are forced to run as well. Pippin notes that he had a few guards around him, making sure that he kept up the pace, and we also learn that every once in a while, a vision of Aragorn bending down to the ground tracking them would come into Pippin's mind. But again, Pippin had some quick thinking and thought about how there was no way Aragorn would know about the state of things with how many tracks were around with this large company running through the land. After this thought, Pippin suddenly has a good idea, and as they approach a misty portion of their journey, Pippin dives off to the side straight into the mist. The company halts at Ugluk's command, and there was sudden turmoil as they all wondered where Pippin went. He quickly started running, but noticed that the orcs were quickly chasing after him. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to make it far, he at least was hopeful that now Aragorn would see his tracks off to the side, running away, and not muddled up in the main path. This is also when he had another brilliant idea, and right before arms reach out to seize him, he reaches up to the clasp of his cloak, undoes it, and throws it to the ground. He is then suddenly grabbed by some orcs, and he thinks to himself about how it probably will lie there on the ground until the end of his days, never being found by anyone. But as we know, he has done a significant thing here, which helps their pursuers quite a bit. Once again, I think it's important to note how great Pippin is in this moment. He really is stepping up in this dire situation, not once, but twice now. Especially for the movie, Pippin is made out to be a goofball who makes a severe mistake at least once per movie. But in the book, he isn't nearly as bad, and this moment goes to show how even as he is the youngest of the group, he still can keep his wits about him and make quick decisions that will ultimately help them get rescued later on. The next change is that the Northerners do eventually depart from the group. They are sick of traveling under Ugluk's command, in the sunlight, and without even getting to kill or torture the halflings. As for their part, there really is no point in them being there. After some more running, Pippin eventually passes out again and gets carried for a little bit before waking up in the grass next to a stream and some mountains in the distance. He overhears Ugluk shouting at some of the Northerners from the group, saying that he and his Uruk-hai will finish the job and they can leave, threatening them to leave before he knocks off a few more heads. Pippin then watches as over 100 orcs run off, leaving only the Uruk-hai under Ugluk's command, and only leaving a few of the larger and braver members of the Northern Company. Then, Pippin notices Grishnak and a few more orcs coming back up to Ugluk. Evidently, Grishnak, after disappearing during their last fight, had gone back to meet up with his Nazgul commander and get orders. The Nazgul had told him to pursue Ugluk and meet back up with him to keep an eye on things. Pippin also notices that in the distance, he could hear horses, which seemed to be what the host of orcs and Uruk-hai were worried about, and what was causing the Northerners to leave. A funny side note is that Ugluk references the Nazgul, asking Grishnak why he hasn't come along. Ugluk even says, has he had another mount shot out from under him? This is in reference to the shot that Legolas took on the Anduin River, which downed the fell beast with the Nazgul on top. Ugluk says that if the Nazgul had come, that he would actually have been useful, as he doesn't believe Grishnak will be of any use in the fight to come. As at this point, the attack from the riders of Rohan seems inevitable to the Uruk-hai. After Ugluk and Grishnak finish their conversation, Ugluk has them set back out again and they run toward the forest, where the Northerners had already set out before. Tolkien writes that eventually they overtook the Northerners, who were slower in the sun. The Uruk-hai and orcs jeered them, saying that they will be taken out by the riders, who are quickly gaining on them. So at this point, the entire troop of orcs and Uruk-hai are sprinting towards Fangorn, which is far off in the distance, trying to outrun the riders of Rohan. And they are also carrying the hobbits again, as they wouldn't be going too fast if the hobbits were running. Now let's move on to our second to last change, which is in regards to the riders of Rohan who are pursuing them. In the movie, these riders are completely cut out and we just see a surprise attack later on in the movie. Like I said earlier, I'm not covering that attack yet, but everything up until that point. So here's what happens in the book. At this point, Pippin notices the horses rounding up the Uruk-hai and orcs, keeping them against the river and running toward the forest. The riders ensured that none of them could escape to the side and were strategically trapping them in. Pippin then began worrying about how even if the riders caught up and attacked the orcs, they would probably kill the two hobbits as they would have mistaken them for orcs. Pippin notes that the riders of Rohan had archers among them, and as they ran, arrows would come down every once in a while and take out stragglers who lagged behind. But the archers would quickly retreat after firing a shot and get out of the way so as not to be shot by the orcs, who had poor aim as they were still trying to run while firing arrows. And lastly, we come to when the enemy group gets cornered by the riders. Eventually, the orcs and Uruk-hai could go no further as horsemen had surrounded them, although at a great distance, ensuring that none could escape in any direction. The key change here is that the forest is still a ways out, and a few members of the company even ran towards it, but only a few returned, as most of them were killed. Ugluk then orders the hobbits to be put down and their legs bound again, with guards set by them to ensure they wouldn't scream or escape. And on that note, I will leave it off for this week. A bit of a cliffhanger, I know, but the movie does depict the attack and Merry and Pippin's escape later on, so we'll cover those changes at that scene. As for this week, I want to hear from you. What do you think about these changes Peter Jackson made? How does this chapter in the book compare with what we see in the movie? As always, be sure to like and subscribe and go to the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.